And thanks also to the previous speakers for covering a lot of the ground that I was going to at the start of my slides as well, so I can save a bit of time there. And also thank you to Microsoft, actually, for giving me 12 years to have an ability to keep on innovating in agriculture. It's not been my sole focus, but it's always been a sideline, and I'm looking forward to moving on very shortly to focusing 100% on agriculture, and there'll be more news on that in the coming weeks. So I've thought a lot, and have had the privilege for the last 4 years of really trying to realize transformational impact or impact in a way that generates value in agriculture from Microsoft in terms of working with organizations to do things like realize the sorts of value that you're seeing listed on the right-hand side of the slide. And pretty obvious things in terms of there is value in there. If you can make someone more money from using something, improve their productivity, but also things like give them more sleep in the day, then there might be some arguments there for continuing to do it or developing this further. So when we talk about innovation and we hear about a lot of potential being shown, we also talk about the need for more on-the-ground tests, trials, what I call closed-loop analyses of how we generate value, which is in the real system, ultimately is the person using the system, the new system, or the recipient of the benefits from that net positive. They're going to get value from that. And that's the research and development I do. It's no longer trying to figure out, well, can we address this scientific question? It's right, the scientific and technology questions are answered enough. What's the new business scenario that we can trial where we can measure, are you getting more sleep? Or are you happier? Or are the animals more healthy? And wonderfully, that's, there is now a thriving, maybe not a thriving enough pipeline of R&D really focusing on that in agriculture. And a number of the areas of focus have been on that. So wonderfully, one of the talks right at the start of the day talked about, the Fitbits on the cow, giving back the farmer some sleep in terms of having an alarm going off when the cows are showing that they're in estrus. And so, an alarm can go off and they can go and see the cow. But interestingly, so that there's some value there, and we can identify scenarios where having that, for example, maximizing the chances of getting a female calf, we can get some benefits back, like not having so many male calves born, which have to be dealt with in various ways. But then when you identify that value returning step and get that started, then the technology also can improve to make that even more valuable over time. So the bottom left is the replacement to these Fitbits that people have alluded to, that, well, rather than having some very specialized, sophisticated sensor on the leg of the cow, how much can we just deduce from a camera, a smart camera eyeballing what's going on, or camera balling what's going on, in terms of, can we just take a standard camera that you can buy and put a little computer behind it, and it has the ability to not just recognize that there are cows there and count them, but recognize the individual cows. And then moving on to, well, the individual sheep is lame, and starting to infer the properties of what the disease might be. And so, as we had talked about this morning, the technology is changing so fast that, of course, our ability to address and realize that value is changing all the time. But the key thing is identifying the new mechanism through which that value is realized for all the participants. And that's the key area of focus that I work on. So again, top right there is the sorts of forecasts that I used to do in the past. That's of crop development, but it could equally be of animal body mass over time, or their temperature development over time, and predicting that into the future. But very few farmers are going to look at that and make a decision for all manner of reasons I'm sure you're aware of. What we need is then it to be put in a way that people can actually use it. So the phone in the middle, this was rolled out about 3 years ago, and the farmers who used it increased their profits by 20%, which is the sort of value that gets them using it more. And ultimately, it's the same kind of forecast going into that phone, but the sophistication was pushing to them just the sort of information that they needed, which is when's the most optimum time to sow their crops in the west coast of India to coincide with the onset of the monsoon, because timing that right means that you get the best possible crop and maximize the utilization of the rain and temperature coming over from the monsoon. And then the additional application of AI on top in terms of making this more effective overall is we could just take out-of-the-box machine translation. So we issue our instructions in English, but it gets translated into Hindi or the local language using AI on top of that without any additional coding, because it's just a service that you can now get. And that's the sort of state that we want to get to, is that people can just get off of the shelf a lot of these types of capabilities. So I had the pleasant surprise earlier this year of this company. It's kind of shown in the middle. These are people on a supply chain, and Consus, a startup in the UK, does tracking solutions for goods in supply chains. And just to address the problem of costs of signing seasonal workers in and out on supply chains, they implemented a face recognition solution so that people could just turn up, okay, you're getting working, they didn't have to sign in, and then they were clocked out when they left. Now, we also need to be very careful about the implementation of all manners of AI without thinking in terms of the overall business consequences, and that's another reason for why we have to do these closed-loop analyses, because in trying to identify the new value, you also identify all these additional costs and risks. My experience in implementing new data analytic solutions in business, when you actually get to the first point of, okay, so is there a benefit of that? Does it work? It normally works out as more expensive than not having done it in the first place. And then the innovation starts on top as, well, what's gone wrong? Why did that happen? Our hypothesis at the start was it would be 10 times more valuable. And then you identify the ways in which you make it 10, 100 times more profitable than you thought initially. But it doesn't stop at just the first realization of the balance of costs and benefits. You have to stick with it to really work out to make it derive value. You've seen this too many times already. I put it up to make the point that, of course, we're hearing a lot about artificial intelligence nowadays, and it's been around for a long time. But what people mean now when they talk about artificial intelligence most generally is any situation where the computer is giving you something smart in response to inputs. So when people are talking nowadays about using artificial intelligence in X, often when you look at how they're using it, well, you're basically you're not using deep learning, you're not using some face recognition or some interpretation of sound. Oftentimes you are, and that has been the thing that's jumped us on quite a bit. But because the computers are now so much faster and so much more accessible, then it's opening up ways in which we knew how to do things before, but in a far more usable way. And so in terms of when people are talking about artificial intelligence, my first question is, well, how do you, in terms of their solution, what do you actually mean by artificial intelligence in this case? Are you talking about deep learning and us needing 1 million images before we even get started? Or is it just basically an expert system that has all the possible symptoms on the one side and all the possible things it could be on the other side, and it's just doing a lookup, and that's something that we had in the 1980s, 1970s, or whatever. And all of those are valid if they're delivering value. So we shouldn't, we should just be focusing on how we identify the value from the implementation of these things. But things like this are very exciting because they're very enabling. So this is basically showing different examples of reaching human parity with deep learning models. The ability to recognize images, the ability to translate speech. The AI can do a lot of cognitive capabilities better than humans now, which is very enabling. So the sorts of real-time current case studies that we've been working on with businesses for them to get value from applications of AI are then on the right. Actually, they were shown in those previous slides as well in terms of the images. So doing things like predicting diseases, recognizing and signing in your workers, saying what inputs to apply where and when in farm management applications and things like that. I think you've got that by now. I find this quite useful as well in terms of when we're actually trying to incorporate a new technology, particularly some data analytics, into our workflows in order to derive value, and trying to figure out how do we get value out of that. And I find this very helpful in organizing our thinking. And this is basically applies to any application of a technology in order to derive value. So when people are thinking about, oh, you know, now with the advances of AI, we can predict this and we can predict that, often one of the first things you realize is that, well, you haven't looked at the data at all anyway. I mean, what does the data, first of all, show you? We have to understand it in the context of the system. And that's right back to basic descriptive analytics. So, you know, the equivalent of the stethoscope. The stethoscope is the machine that you use, and it tells you the heartbeat. And that's the machine computation, if you like. That's going from data, the heartbeat, through the machine, the descriptive analytics, into the value. But the lion's share of the computation is being done in the human's head. Diagnostic analytics is then building on that and being able to relate that with other things and start to think. Then the human goes, okay, well, given that relationship and those relationships there, what could be going on? And then they're using their computational intelligence. And then predictive analytics is then, well, given the data and so on, what could be happening next? Whereas prescriptive analytics is saying, I think this is what's going on. But incorporating analytics and AI into our scenarios in order to derive value still causes us to go back to this. So yes, we might have a fancy AI that allows us to detect a cow, but are we using that, for example, to just understand where the cows are because they aren't where they should be, and that might just be descriptive analytics, and it's just feeding into, you know, information on where our cows are? Or is it that the analytics saying you need to go out to this field over here, there will be a cow there and it's limping, and you need to clean its feet, or, you know, whatever the treatment is, and it's actually giving you the recommendation, or automatically acting even without your decision making. Now, this is very helpful to really, when you're trying to identify how you deliver value, identify a scenario to settle at, to really run an analysis and see if it holds true. So given all that background, I wanted to talk about some of the bigger problems that we're trying to then tackle in the applications of AI in agriculture that we don't have all the solutions for, but that we're trying to make some inroads into. And I think these are some of the bigger problems we need to solve. And I'll talk about these in the remaining slides. So one is that we're getting an awful lot of smartness, an awful lot of data analytics, an awful lot of apps and things like that on use, not just in the farm, and not just with the veterinary practitioner going to the farm, but in the whole rural community, you know, in the farmhouse, in the bus service, in the flood prevention systems. And there's an awful lot of excitement and investment in smart cities, and how we need to be a bit more joined up to avoid everyone building independent systems and them not working and us having to rebuild again. We need to start thinking about, well, how do we support smart rural communities? Because a lot of the fundamental capabilities we need to enable the use of these systems would be helped an awful lot if it was far less laborious to be able to connect our systems and be able to get that information. And I'll show you some examples of where we're doing that in Microsoft. Another big area is that increasingly getting value from doing data analytics, getting value from something a farmer's measuring with a system or is being measured for them, is now being measured by lots of different organizations. And you go to any farm in the UK, particularly one that's been running for a long time, it's quite large, has a history in collecting data. You see piles of decaying floppy disks and piles of memory pens and tons of data that's not actually being used and probably never will be used either. And moreover, actually, when you look at the applications of data in agriculture, actually they get better and better the more varied data that you have. So there's an opportunity. So how do we support these sorts of agri-data exchanges such that a farmer, it's like keeping your money under the mattress in the old days, and then we invented banks. So is there an equivalent of a bank, like a custodian of data for farmers into the future? And we're working on how we enable that kind of realization. We need more organizations building the analytics rather than sensors and devices to enable this actionable information from the data that can be received. And I'm working heavily on these kind of closed-loop demonstrations of value. Where's our demonstration farms of really examples of where someone could talk about how they, month on month, year on year, are actually using these new technologies and getting more money in their pocket or other forms of value. So an example is, and this talks to the previous talk actually, is how we enable farmers to have these affordable digital agriculture solutions given the complications that we have on farm. So lack of connectivity, no power, how the heck you bring this together, this data to give you a unified picture about the thing that you care about, and slow connectivity at farm office. And to cut to the chase, with the majority of computers now that are doing analytics over data, not having a person in front of them because it's a sensor, it's a node on the farm. 99% in the future, it'll be computers that won't have a screen attached to them, but are sensing something. The big opportunity for organizations like mine is what's the operating system for that sort of environment? Because setting up a sensor and getting data from it and doing analytics on it is like 40 years ago when you wanted to get your computer to compute some numbers or write you a letter or whatever. You needed a degree in computer science to make the big thing work. So wouldn't it be great if we can plug in arbitrary sensor, like you do a USB thing on your computer, and you know what you're doing with it? So what's the operating system for that? And that's the big future in terms of democratizing the ability to get information from these systems. And so in order to address that, then FarmBeats is an example of how we can build these sorts of enabling capabilities. So, for example, to address connectivity issues, FarmBeats is a piece of software that can be deployed on edge systems, and boxes on farms and sensors on farms that can communicate in a wide range of ways such that data can travel long distances. So one is to use TV white space, which is the unused bands of the electromagnetic spectrum, that you can send data over much larger distances, 100 kilometers, in order to get data back from sensors and devices. But you don't have to depend on that. So a FarmBeats box, the operating system that you deploy, comes ready prepared to speak in terms of TV white space, LoRa, Wi-Fi. An implementation we did in Kenya last year, it was the 3D SIM card from the phone, stick it in the box. So that's one example. Another is then how do you enable the system to manage its power intelligently, to be adaptable to whether you can plug it into the mains and then you're good, but what if you have a wind turbine or solar panels? And more than that, energy is fluctuating over time, battery power is changing over time. The system learns to collect data in a smart way and send and receive data so as to conserve battery life and maximize the acquisition of information. And partly to help address that, another element is to then include machine learning within the systems themselves, and this is a development of sensors and devices that you can then deploy the machine learning, the AI, to the edge. And so an example that we did on this particular farm is where we used just a few expensive soil moisture meters to get a calibration in terms of soil moisture in the field, but then we used very cheap aerial imagery, not even from a drone, from a balloon that you walk around the farm with. And then you can use very straightforward machine learning on the boxes to then give you a high precision 1 centimeter resolution map of things like moisture and pH, so that the farmers aren't having to pay an absolute fortune or to put lots of sophisticated sensors out there, or even pay a fortune to get some sophisticated hyperspectral imagery, but it can be done almost as if, again, it's like if the farmer looks across their farm and sees some yellowing on a field, then their machine learning or their human learning in their brains going, well, I know this field, that's drought, so that's a dry patch. So it's teaching the camera to be able to do that as well. And these are just shots of doing the aerial observation from a suspended balloon. I'll skip that. So FarmBeats is something that's actually going into public preview in a few months' time, and it's really trying to accelerate the adoption of smart agricultural solutions in the countryside by providing an operating system that can be deployed to devices. And so we have partners we're working with that are looking at, have built solutions for livestock, for poultry. I'll show you an example in a second, as well as being able to get information from the vehicles and the different machines and things like that that are on farm. And then we're supporting from our end the ability to make the operating system speak in terms of all of the different types of information that you can have coming in. That's on the bottom, so your weather feeds, your drone data, your sensor data, and then putting into it things that help make the overall system useful. So can you get out of the box a system that can recognize an animal? And we've actually got a cloud service that would do that. So if you have camera trap imagery nowadays, you don't need to train an AI to recognize, is that a gazelle or whatever, send the image to the cloud and it'll come back and say that's a gazelle. So it's greatly accelerating the pace at which you can get useful information from that sort of data. This is an example actually from FarmBeats of then identifying, this is an example of descriptive analytics of then actually running ML on the edge, and that's there's these boxes that are on the farmhouse to stitch together the imagery to then have a composite that you can zoom into and you can apply AI to identify issues. So for example, on the right, a stray cow. So you could have an algorithm that say, well, cows should not be there, maybe based on the cow's movement patterns, it's showing some distress or whatever. You could raise an alert and just simply draw the farmer's attention to that. These are examples of applying FarmBeats. This is an example of the high-resolution soil moisture information. I recently did a project in Kenya where it was about providing the tea management people with an understanding of what the readiness of the tea crop is across the estates, so that this is how they get the value, is then working out how many people they need every week and then throughout the week to employ in order to do the harvesting. So that's how to get the kind of closed loop on the value. And I was delighted. We had a hackathon about a year ago with Cornell University. A couple of students put together a poultry monitoring system using FarmBeats based on the audio signals and video of what's going on in the poultry sheds, within a couple of days having a system to be able to raise an alert in terms of thefts and things that should be looked at in poultry sheds. Fast forwarding a year, and now there's a whole blossoming of organizations that are applying AI in poultry production systems to detect issues, and the big thing is positive animal welfare signals. Okay. I'm going to skip the data sharing thing because it's, I'm going to save time. And I'll skip this too. So the big concept that I think we need to get to in order to simplify things, and we need this for ourselves, but we're getting towards this with our livestock management, our individual animals, as well as our individual fields. Agrimetrics is an example of having field-related data for that specific field, is the concept of the digital twin. So that really the unit of operation that we're working with is that specific cow. And then within that, we can build in whatever the analytics is that tells us about the particular health of the cow, where and when it is. But with that being a consistent interface, then we can be improving that over time. If we can define standard interfaces such that organizations can come to a digital twin-like system and go, boy, have I got a better detector for you for detecting influenza outbreaks in pigs or whatever it is, then I think we're going to need this so that we don't have 50 different services and 50 different algorithms all relating to my pig, and I don't know what I'm doing. So I think this is going to be an emergent concept, is going to be the digital twin. So I hope that's given you some insights into some of the bigger problems we need to be addressing in terms of actually how we're going to be enabling these agricultural communities of the future are going to need help in working with this explosion of analytical services, as well as the myriad data sets that are there. And we can't just expect them to continue to add apps and apps and apps and technologies and technologies and technologies without some higher level of organization on top. And I think there's a real opportunity both for guidance from the community in terms of what really is needed, and then in organizations who are going to go and trial these types of systems. Thank you very much.